Shadows of Anatolia, the Armenian Genocide, 1915 to 1917. The Armenian Genocide stands as one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century, marking the first modern, systematic attempt to eliminate an entire people based on their ethnicity. Occurring primarily between 1915 and 1917, this catastrophic event involved the mass deportation, starvation, and execution of the Armenian population living within the Ottoman Empire. By the time the violence subsided, an estimated 1.5 million Armenians had perished, and an ancient civilization was uprooted from its ancestral homeland. The genocide was not a random outburst of violence, but a calculated campaign orchestrated by the Ottoman government, the repercussions of which are still felt in geopolitical discourse today. To understand the genocide, one must look at the crumbling state of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Once a dominant superpower, the empire was known as the sick man of Europe, losing territory and prestige rapidly. Inside its borders, the Armenians were a Christian minority who had lived in the Anatolian region for millennia. While they were historically treated as second-class citizens, under the Ottoman millet system, they had managed to thrive culturally and economically. However, as the empire shrank, internal tensions rose, and the Armenians began to be viewed not as loyal subjects, but as a potential internal threat and a scapegoat for the empire's failures. The political climate shifted drastically with the rise of the Young Turks and their political party, the Committee of Union and Progress (CUP), which seized power in 1908. Initially promising reform and equality, the CUP's ideology quickly morphed into a radical form of nationalism known as pan-Turkism. This ideology envisioned a homogeneous Turkish state expanding eastward into Central Asia. The Christian Armenians, situated geographically between the Turks of Anatolia and the Turkic peoples of the Caucasus, were seen as a physical and demographic obstacle to this imperial dream. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 provided the cover the CP needed to implement a radical solution to the Armenian question. The Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, against the Allied powers, Britain, France, and Russia. When the Ottoman army suffered a humiliating defeat against Russian forces at the Battle of Sarıkamış in early 1915, the government falsely blamed Armenian treachery for the loss. This accusation served as the pretext for the government to initiate a program of removal and extermination, framing it as a necessary wartime security measure. The systematic destruction began on the night of April 24, 1915, a date now commemorated annually as Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day. In a coordinated operation known as Red Sunday, Ottoman authorities arrested hundreds of Armenian intellectuals, politicians, writers, and community leaders in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. These individuals, the brain trust of the Armenian community, were deported, tortured, and eventually murdered. By decapitating the leadership of the community first, the government ensured that the remaining Armenian population would be disorganized and unable to mount an effective resistance. Simultaneously, the government moved against Armenian men of fighting age. Armenians serving in the Ottoman army were disarmed, removed from their units, and reassigned to labor battalions. Stripped of their weapons and ability to defend their families, these men were worked to death in grueling conditions or taken out in groups and summarily executed by Ottoman soldiers or irregular bands. This effectively removed the physical protection for the remaining Armenian population, which consisted largely of women, children, and the elderly. With the leadership gone and the able-bodied men liquidated, the government implemented the Tehcir Law, deportation law, in May 1915. This legislation authorized the deportation of anyone perceived as a threat to national security. Under this quasi-legal guise, the entire Armenian population of Anatolia was ordered to leave their homes. They were told they were being relocated to resettlement zones in the Syrian desert for their own safety, a deception designed to prevent panic and ensure compliance. The ensuing death marches were the primary instrument of the genocide. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians were forced to walk hundreds of miles south toward the desert regions of Deir ez-Zor in present-day Syria. The conditions were horrific. Deportees were denied food and water, exposed to the scorching sun and subjected to constant physical abuse. Ottoman gendarmes guarding the caravans often facilitated attacks by Kurdish tribes and criminals who robbed, raped, and murdered the defenseless marchers. The brutality of the marches was compounded by the involvement of the Special Organization, Tehcir Law. This paramilitary unit, composed largely of released convicts and overseen by the CUP leadership, was tasked with the dirty work of the genocide. They operated with impunity, conducting massacres along the deportation routes. Reports from the time describe rivers clogged with bodies and valleys piled high with the dead. For the vast majority of Armenians, the destination of the desert was not a resettlement zone, but a vast, open-air grave. International observers at the time were well aware of the atrocities. Henry Morgenthau, the U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, sent urgent cables to Washington describing a campaign of race extermination. Missionaries, German military advisors, and diplomats from various nations documented the slaughter in diaries and photographs. Despite these reports and a joint declaration by the Allied powers in May 1915 condemning these crimes against humanity, the world was consumed by the Great War, and no effective intervention was mounted to stop the killing. By the end of World War I in 1918, the Ottoman Empire had collapsed, and the magnitude of the destruction became clear. The Armenian population of Anatolia had been virtually erased. Military tribunals were held in Constantinople, where key architects of the genocide, including the three pashas, Talat, Enver, and Jamal, were tried in absentia and sentenced to death for their crimes. However, these leaders had already fled the country. Many were later assassinated by Armenian revolutionaries in a covert operation known as Operation Nemesis, seeking the justice the international courts failed to deliver. Despite the tribunals, the narrative regarding the events shifted dramatically with the founding of the Republic of Turkey in 1923. The new Turkish government rejected the term genocide and established a policy of denial that continues to this day. The official state narrative argues that the deaths were the result of intercommunal violence, famine, and the chaotic conditions of World War I, rather than a state-sponsored plan of extermination. This denial has become a major point of contention in international relations and historiography. The systematic nature of the Armenian massacres was instrumental in the creation of the very word genocide. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer who lost his own family in the Holocaust, coined the term in 1944. Lemkin explicitly stated that he created the word to describe the sort of coordinated destruction that happened to the Armenians, as well as the Jews under Nazi Germany. Thus, the Armenian genocide serves as the prototype for the legal and historical definition of the crime, bridging the gap between ancient barbarism and modern, bureaucratic mass murder. Today, the legacy of the genocide is a global issue. The Armenian diaspora, formed largely by the survivors who scattered across the globe to France, the United States, Russia, and the Middle East, has worked tirelessly for recognition. As of the 21st century, dozens of countries and international bodies have officially recognized the events of 1915 as genocide. This recognition is not merely about semantics. It is viewed by descendants as essential for the restoration of dignity to the victims and a necessary step toward healing intergenerational trauma. In the end, the Armenian genocide was a cataclysmic event that reshaped the demographics of the Middle East and defined the modern concept of crimes against humanity. It was a deliberate, systematic effort by the Ottoman state to extinguish the Armenian people, resulting in the death of 1.5 million innocents. While the denial of these events persists in some political corridors, the historical record remains clear. Remembering the Armenian genocide is vital not only to honor the victims but to recognize the warning signs of intolerance and hatred that can lead to such atrocities again.